For example, in this book by Snyderman and Rothman, the IQ controversy, it's a survey of a little over 1,000 of the elite psychologists in the country. And over 50% of these elite psychologists agree with Murray. They believe that there's a genetic difference in intelligence between IQ and school success. That's how they responded in this survey. There were 47% who answered yes, there's a genetic difference of the ones surveyed, but of the ones who responded, 47% responded, over half of the ones who responded said they believed that white people were more intelligent than black genetically.
Good evening and welcome to For the People. Books roll off the presses in America like so many apples on a conveyor belt. But every now and then a book captures the public's attention and a debate about its value ensues. Such a book is The Bell Curve, co-written by Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein. For an educated analysis of this book, we turn to Dr. Asa G. Hilliard III, the Fuller E. Calloway Professor of Urban Education at Georgia State University. Dr. Hilliard is an internationally respected expert in the field of psychology and testing. Dr. Hilliard, the book, The Bell Curve by Charles Murray, is getting a lot of press. What is this book about?
The Bell Curve is about the same thing that earlier psychology was about. It's about the same thing that Arthur Jensen wrote about, William Shockley, Herrnstein, who is the co-author with Murray, and several other psychologists who have argued that black people are genetically inferior to white people in intelligence, that we don't think and learn as well as white people do because of our race. And so this is a book that attempts to paint a picture as if it is scientific, as if that statement or that conclusion is scientific. And it's fat. It's almost, I guess, several hundreds of pages.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of the book?
Well, I think it's science. It's what I would call pseudoscience, and that's really the major message about the book, is that it is not scientific, because unfortunately most of the conversation that I'm hearing about this book is an appeal to people's moral sense. They say it's an immoral book, or they say it's an unfair book, or they say it's a book about bias that fails to recognize bias. But the fundamental problem with this book is it's not science. And there are many reasons make me say that, and we'll get into that as we go along.
What are those reasons?
Well, there are several fundamental things that makes it unscientific. First place, the way that Murray uses the term race is unscientific. It's not biology. He did not in any way connect what he did to biology. In fact, his use of the term race, he actually, when he uses that term, substitutes the term ethnicity. And it's obvious that he had trouble trying to sort people into racial groups. And most reputable biologists have given up on that a long time ago. We understand the surface differences that people have. That some people are dark, some people are light, some people have straight hair, some people have curly hair. There are facial angles, and these, what are called phenotypical features, are clear to anyone to see, but no one has been able to group those together in a way that will allow them, in a scientific sense, to say that that is race. Race is mostly a convention, a social and even a political convention, and it's a little hard to treat a political category as if it's a biological category. So he gets around this by saying what he's really talking about is ethnicity, and then of course you're into whatever people say they are is what they are. And so to start out with, it's a little hard to compare the races until you specify what you mean by race. He never did it. That's just one example. Now, another example of why it's not science is that it is not measurement. That is to say, the test itself. In the first case, I was talking about the people who are being used in the sample, but the test itself, the IQ test itself, is not mental measurement. I want to make the point that I'm not talking about it's not a mental measurement for African people, but it's not a mental measurement for any people. It's not a mental measurement for European people, for white people. It is not mental measurement for a very good reason. You don't have the kind of information, that is language and cultural information, cannot be treated like water, gas, wood, you know, things that are like that, because language and culture are very diversified. And there's a wonderful book that deals with this business of measurability that was done by Paul Houtz. He edited this book, The Myth of Measurability. And this is only one of many textual references that discuss the scientific, the misuse of science by calling IQ tests measures. If you're a physicist or a chemist or a mathematician, when you use the term measurement in its strictest sense, you're normally talking about being able to develop something called an interval scale, which is like a ruler, where every inch on the ruler covers the same amount of space. You cannot be sure that every word on a vocabulary test covers the same amount of brain power. And the reason you can't do that is you don't know what the words mean to the people who you're trying to interrogate. And what we do know is that language and culture is diversified among human beings to such extent that it makes it impossible to be sure that you're comparing like things, and therefore you can't construct a measurement device. This is simply one of the texts that that deals with that, and there's much more that could be said about it. But so that would be a second reason why it's not science. If you can't measure, it's not science. If you can't identify your population, it's not science. A third reason is that his book is not science because it's also not genetics. There's almost no genetics in the book. In other words,
and you've read the entire book.
I read the whole book. Geneticists, what you would have to do is to submit what Murray did to a reputable group of geneticists, and then find out whether the geneticists would say that he is adequately representing genetic truths. And of course, he makes reference, he assumes genetics. For example, he assumes that you've got two different groups that have these different genes, but he doesn't show which genes he's talking about. And in effect, the genetics is a psychologist's use of inferential genetics, I guess you'd say. So I'm saying there's no genetics, there's no measure, there's no scientific use of the term race. He also fails in science. Scientists do something they call controlling for variation. In other words, if I want to know whether the score that a person earns on an intelligence test is related to the achievement that they're going to make later on. And that's what he does. He argues that IQ and achievement scores are related to each other. That's okay to do that. But if you're going to be scientific and making comparisons between people who had an IQ score and an achievement score, you have to know what happened to those people in between the scores, in between the time that they took the IQ test and the time they had the academic achievement. In other words, there's an intervening experience. Person A went to a very wealthy private school and had a lot of nurturing from their teachers. Person B went to a school where there was a high turnover rate for teachers, maybe in a low-income neighborhood, with a different quality of educational treatment. That kind of quality of educational treatment has been described in a book by Jonathan Kozol that's called Savage Inequalities, where he documents the fact that here are these children mainly in poverty neighborhoods that in no way get the same kind of educational opportunity, the opportunity to learn that the very wealthy children get. So if you measure the IQ of those two children and you measure their achievement without paying attention to what happened to them in their school, then you can't account, scientifically, you can't account for the relationship between IQ and school success, because you left out important things in that equation. And so Murray knows nothing about the power of instruction, which is also well documented. In other words, there's a body of research literature that has to be accounted for in order to do what he's doing in the book, The Bell Curve. So that would be, those would be at least 4 major areas where a scientist would have had to have paid close attention.
What exactly is Murray saying about the intelligence of black people versus the intelligence of white people?
Well, what he's saying is that white people are more intelligent than black people.
I mean, in terms of numbers, in the IQ, what is he saying?
Well, he cites an old, his findings agree with the old argument that there's about a 15-point difference in scores on IQ tests between the white population and the black population, and that's true on the IQ score. But so I can't challenge that, but what I challenge is what it means. That the 15-point difference in between African people, European people, doesn't mean that European people are smarter. It simply reveals that on the test that was given, which I'm asserting is not a test of intelligence, it's a test of achievement, it's a test of European culture, it may even be a test of exposure to racism, but it's not, whatever anyone thinks it is not a measure of intelligence.
What can you tell us about the origin of the IQ test?
Well, the IQ test had its origin, as I'm looking at it mainly for school use. The first major effort to do to make an IQ test that could be used for school use was by Alfred Binet and his colleague Simon in France. And the French education authorities approached this psychologist asking him if he could design some way of finding out which kids who were coming to school needed special help. The main reason for this was that a lot of poor kids were coming to school who hadn't come to school before. Binet was a very good psychologist, and what he did was to observe classrooms to see what kinds of tasks teachers asked students to perform. And when he did that, he made up a test, which he later gave to kids. But what he kept in his mind was the idea that kids could get a higher score than the one they actually received the first time they got the test. In other words, that they could change their score on his test. So he decided that he would try to teach these children. And so he taught them through a process that he called mental therapeutics or mental orthopedics. And he found that he was able to raise the score that they got on this test, later to be called the IQ test. And so significantly, what Binet said he had done was that he had raised their intelligence. That That's a very significant idea, because that's not the idea that people like Murray have when they use the IQ test. It's not the American idea about intelligence. So the person who made up the first test had one belief about what the human mind was doing, and that belief was that the human mind could grow, that intelligence could be taught. When that test was transported across the water to the United States, Louis Terman at Stanford University made what was called the Stanford Binet, which was the United States version of this original French test. And but when he made the test, he literally changed the test in the most profound way. And he changed the test by creating a use which assumed that the mind could not be changed, that intelligence could not be taught, and that whatever number you got the first time was your number forever. Your permanent number. So the idea of permanent intelligence is an American idea, and primarily an American idea, at least in its application.
You said earlier that Murray believes that a low IQ makes for more crime. Does he say whether he's talking about white-collar crime or street crime?
Well, see, that's the important point. See, that's another reason that Murray's book is not science, because the criterion that he's predicting to from IQ is also not defined, like crime. You know, that you say crime, and in most people's mind, what they imagine is somebody who breaks into a jewelry store and steals some diamonds and maybe gets caught and is handcuffed and flying across the hood of a police car, and that is crime. Or maybe they're talking about someone stabbing someone or bringing a gun to school, and of course that is crime. But it's also crime to dump toxic waste outside East St. Louis and create the conditions which produce cancer in a population. That's crime. You know, it's also crime to participate in insider trading on Wall Street. That's crime. But that's not the type of crime that is being talked about in the Murray book. You know, that to find out whether there's a genetic relationship between the insider traders who commit crime and their IQ would be the logical extension of what he starts to do by looking at people on welfare. So the whole business of what crime is, you know, and what many of the things that he's trying to predict to are never really defined except in the social and political sense.
Why do you think the bell curve was written, and why do you think it is getting such phenomenal press?
Well, I think it's pretty clear why the book is written. When you read the book, the authors are making many recommendations about social policy, or they're suggesting that we think about things in a certain way. For example, by thinking that people on the bottom can't be helped, then it's only a short step to the fact that it may be a waste of money to try to educate, to try to preserve health, and so forth. And so obviously they have social policy in mind, and not merely a curiosity about the relationship between IQ in one group and IQ in another. There are certain actions that they want people to take. And I think that it's also clear that it comes at a time where what is written in the book is really a part of what is widely agreed upon in the culture as a whole. In other words, there are two things that are very interesting. For example, in this book by Snyderman and Rothman, the IQ controversy, is a survey of 1,000, a little over 1,000 of the elite psychologists in the country. And over 50% of these elite psychologists agree with Murray. They believe that there's a genetic difference in intelligence between IQ and school success. That's how they responded in this survey. There were 47% who answered yes, there's a genetic difference of the ones surveyed, but of the ones who responded, 47% responded, over half of the ones who responded said they believed that white people were more intelligent than black genetically.
So the notion that Murray is letting out some little secret is not
Well, no, but let's follow the line, because there's another survey that was also done of whites and others in the general population. And this was done at the Chicago's Opinion Research Center between the University of Chicago and the University of California, San Diego. Two scientists a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, surveyed the general population. They found out that approximately 57% of the whites in America believe that black people are genetically inferior to whites in intelligence. So you have Murray's book, then you have better than 50%, I think it's around 54% of the respondents in this survey of the elite psychologists in the country who agree with that point of view. Then you have approximately 57% of the general population who agree and who are willing to say so. So I don't think it's a secret, and it's clearly an opinion that is well supported in the general culture. Many of your viewers will want references and things to read, and especially the state-of-the-art scientific references. This is an extremely important book. There was a conference in 1988 in Melbourne, Australia. And it was a gathering of the world's top psychologists. And the purpose of that conference was to figure out what did they really know about intelligence and what did they really know about the measurement of intelligence. And the conclusions are in this book. There are a series of papers. This is a list of the top papers presented at this top conference. And to my knowledge, there's been no summit conference on intelligence since then. As far as I know, Murray was not at this conference. But the point was that there were 3 things that came out in this conference that are related to that book. One, at the conference, they could not agree after all of these years on what intelligence is. So there's no scientific definition of intelligence. There's all kinds of competing theories, but there's no agreement. That's not the strongest argument, though. The strongest argument is that when you try to measure intelligence, what this group of conferees agreed with was that they finally understand that the attempt to measure intelligence is going to be contaminated because you're trying to measure intelligence in a particular situation or a context. That I'm a product of my neighborhood, you know, that my intelligence has to be manifest through the things that I learned to do, not through the things that were learned to do across town that I've never been exposed to. That's a different context. I'm in one context, someone else is in the other context. Psychologists tried to ignore context and create a universal instrument that would measure everybody in exactly the same way. What this conference said, you can't do that. That what things mean, they mean only in the context where you took your measure. Now, most IQ tests, like the Wechslers and the Binets, do not pay attention to what I just said. And the last thing that was presented at this conference and unrebutted was that if you put someone in a problem-solving situation and you give them a very complicated problem and you see who solves that problem, and the problem is new. If it's a new problem, complicated, and you give them an IQ test and see whether the high IQ people do better than the low IQ people on this problem, what they find is there's no relationship between the IQ score and complex, novel problem-solving ability. Now that's the thing that the IQ test is supposed to be able to do best. And here it has no effect whatsoever, which is another scientific way of saying that the IQ test is basically pseudoscience, that we don't have a way to find out what human potential is. No one knows. One of the things I wanted to be sure and talk about was the fact that there is a literature, a wide body of literature on the political use of psychology, and on the fact that in the area of mental measurement there have been some fabulous mistakes. in history, and there continue to be fabulous mistakes in this area of whether you can really measure the human mind. And one of the classic books, of course, one of the earliest classic books is by Robert Guthrie, Even the Rat Was White. And this is a documentation of racism in psychology, and especially racism in the science of mental measurement. How scientists tried to play, for example, with the variable of race. And one of the things we can show in here is how they actually had things like color wheels here to determine the amount of pigment so that they could get a sample group of black and white. So you do the color wheel to determine whether you're black or white. And then they had the texture of the hair, for example, from straight to kinky. And so I guess that you had to have this little chart when people came in the room to decide whether they went in the black room or the white room, the shapes of the lips. And so they were playing around, and they never really were able to get a fix on race. So you notice that in Murray's book, they don't do this anymore. But this is some of the early work where psychologists were interested in the difference in IQ between blacks and white. And he was documenting their racism. There's lots of information on that. And the second book, which is equally important, by Harvard professor Stephen Jay Gould, which is referenced in Murray's book, although Bob Guthrie's book isn't, interestingly enough. Bob Guthrie is a black psychologist, but Stephen Gould is a white psychologist at Harvard, and he writes this book, The Mismeasure of Man. And I think the key word is this word measure. And it's like this book here, The Myth of Measurability. Whether anybody, white or black, can be measured for the amount of intelligence they have with an IQ test. And the fact is they cannot, and because they cannot, the entire hundreds of pages of books of Murray's collapses like a deck of cards, like a house made out of cards. Because all of it rests on the assumption that you can measure the mind, and he can't.